Chapter 3 America. Early in 1935, I realized that more decisive efforts would be needed if I was ever to get to the United States. Although I saved every penny I could lay hands on, there was still not enough to pay for a passage. Then I thought of a relative who might help, a man who had moved years ago to Lagos in Nigeria. To Lagos I went. Rather than dip into my precious savings to meet the cost of transport, I decided to stow away on a boat which was leaving Axim for Lagos. Mingling with the crew, I slipped on board and stayed down with the firemen for the whole of the voyage, sharing their food and the extreme discomfort and heat of the boiler room. It was my first experience at sea, and I was violently sick the whole time. Consequently, when I arrived in Lagos, I looked like nothing on earth. Unwashed, unshaven, and with tattered clothing, I certainly looked as if I had worked my passage, and no questions were asked when I got off the boat at Lagos. It would have been unthinkable to visit anyone in such a filthy condition. There was nothing for it but to go to the market and buy a new pair of flannels and a shirt. Hiding behind a mass of clothing on the market stall, I hurriedly changed and emerged looking a more respectable being. It was not until I arrived at my relative's house, however, that I was able to wash and shave. I spent several days here, for my host had many questions to ask about our relations and friends. When the time came for me to leave, he kindly gave me money to supplement my savings and also paid my passage back to Axim. I thanked him in high spirits. My trip to America was at last becoming a reality. Some months before, I had successfully applied to Lincoln University for admission, but only one or two close friends with whom I stayed knew of my plans. Now I strove to complete my arrangements. As there was no American consul in the Gold Coast at the time, I should have to travel first to the United Kingdom to obtain a US visa. Thanks to my kinsman's generosity, I had £100. To this, the chief of Nsaum, another relative, added £50, out of which I paid for a third-class passage from Takoradi to Liverpool. Within a month of my return from Lagos, everything was in order, and I waited impatiently for the day of departure. My joy was overshadowed, however, by the thought of having to break the news to my mother. I knew how much I meant to her, and how deeply she would grieve over my going. Accordingly, I went home and stayed with her for a few days, but it was not until the night before I was due to leave that I had the courage to tell her. She was obviously very shocked, but showed no sign of grief, and we sat up talking the whole night through. I cannot recall all we discussed during those hours, but I remember very clearly my mother listening carefully all that I should do and all that I should avoid whilst I was away. She also related in detail the history of my ancestors, of the chief Aduku Addayi, the first of my forebears to settle in Nzima centuries ago, whose sister Nuia gave birth to my matrilineal line. She also told me of my claim to two stalls or chieftaincies in the country, those of Nsaum in Wasaufiasi and Dadiso in Aurin. I took notes of all that she had told me, and always carried them with me until one day I lost them in a New York subway. The following morning, I packed my possessions onto the canoe, which was to take me across the Ankobra River on the first stage of my journey to Takoradi. As I looked up river, where the swirling muddy waters disappeared among a mass of jungly growth, I saw the women and children of the village standing knee-deep in the water unconcernedly, bathing or washing clothes. At this peaceful picture of African rural life, I felt my first pang of homesickness. I took a deep breath and forced myself to smile as I came back up to the bank to say a final goodbye to my mother. Then I saw that she was in tears. In spite of trying so hard to hide her feelings, this final parting proved to be too much. With tears in my own eyes, I told her that if she would rather I stayed behind, she had only to say so. She stood and looked at me for a good few minutes. "It cannot be helped," she said. "May God and your ancestors guide you." And so, with very heavy hearts, we waved goodbye, little knowing that it would be 12 years before we saw each other again. I boarded the motor vessel Apapa at Takoradi and was shown into a third-class cabin. In these strange surroundings, I felt desperately alone and sat on my bunk close to tears. But as Providence would have it, looking suddenly on bed, I saw a telegram. When I opened the envelope, I found it was from Namdi Ezekere and read, "Goodbye. Remember to trust in God and in yourself." Those few words, so well timed, at once cheered me. I began to count my blessings and to remind myself that this, after all, was the beginning of all that I had planned and saved for. The journey was uneventful except for one quite unforgettable experience. I had struck up an acquaintance with an Indian passenger, and when we arrived at the Canary Islands, he invited me to go ashore and take a look at Las Palmas, the capital. I accepted gladly, and together we went into the town. Not knowing anything of life outside my native country, I followed him in all innocence into a building which looked like a hotel. We sat down at a table, and although I only wanted a glass of water, which was all I ever drank, he insisted on ordering beer from an old woman who was hovering about in the shadows. The beer arrived and was immediately followed by two elegant Spanish girls in negligees. I kept my eyes glued to the table legs and prayed that they would hurry up with their business and vanish as quickly as they had come. But to my utter horror and embarrassment, one of them came over and planted herself on my knee and began stroking my hair and generally enveloping me with her limbs. I had only seen white women from a distance, and the fact that one of them should approach me at such uncomfortably close quarters completely unnerved me. I uttered a cry and jumped up, spilling both the woman and the beer onto the floor, and ran as fast as my trembling legs would carry me back to the ship. My Indian friend found this so amusing that he never ceased to laugh about it for the rest of the trip. On arrival in Liverpool, I was met by the agent of George Grant, a timber merchant in Nzima. I stayed in a hotel for the first week, then I travelled up to London in order to have my passport visaed for the United States. Bewildered and very much out of my depth, I began to wonder if it would not be better to give the whole thing up and return home. But just as I was feeling particularly depressed about the future, I heard an excited newspaper boy shouting something unintelligible as he grabbed a bundle of the latest editions from a motor van, and on the placard I read, "Mussolini invades Ethiopia." That was all I needed. At that moment, it was almost as if the whole of London had suddenly declared war on me personally. For the next few minutes, I could do nothing but glare at each impassive face, wondering if those people could possibly realize the wickedness of colonialism, and praying that the day might come when I could play my part in bringing about the downfall of such a system. My nationalism surged to the fore. I was ready and willing to go through hell itself, if need be, in order to achieve my object. When I returned to Liverpool, the timber agent invited me to stay with him and his wife. They were both so hospitable and welcoming that I began to feel less bitter. I was also learning that the ways of the Western world were very different from those of my country. One evening, as we were talking over a meal, the woman said to her husband, "Oh, don't be silly." My eyebrows shot up in surprise, and I waited, anxious and embarrassed, for the man's rebuke. But he took not the slightest offense and carried on talking. In Africa, I dread to think what would have happened to the woman who told her husband not to be silly. Such a remark could have been used at the time as grounds for divorce. Today, of course, with the influence of the West, our women say pretty well what they are thinking, without reserve, and their husbands have had to resign themselves to it. After a fortnight's stay at Liverpool, I set sail for the United States in one of the boats of the Cunard White Star Line. The trip was very much better than my previous one from Takoradi to Liverpool, because I had made several friends, one of them a young Dutchman, who was going out to finish his theological studies at Harvard Divinity School, and remained a good friend of mine the whole time that he was in America. Once we went to a service at the Abyssinian Church in New York, one of the biggest Negro churches that I have ever known. On that Sunday, the church was so packed with people that we could not get inside, and we had to go onto an annex adjoining the main building where another Negro minister was preaching. Acting in a most dramatic fashion, he began to tell us of the story of how Jesus carried the cross to Calvary. After some time, the women in the congregation were completely overawed and began to weep and shout, "It is Jesus! Have mercy! Hallelujah!" There must have been as much noise in that church as from the crowds in Jerusalem centuries before. It was very embarrassing. Here was a European witnessing a most undignified Negro service. As we left the church, I tried to apologize, but he seemed surprised at this and said, with all sincerity, that it was the most beautiful thing he had so far seen in any church. If other demonstrations introduced something like that, he added, they might have a greater following. It was my turn to be astonished, and I believe it was this young man who got me interested in theology. I arrived in New York towards the end of October. London and Liverpool had prepared me for America, otherwise I think the shock of New York after the peace and quiet of my native land would have finished me. I stood open-mouthed at what I saw. There was so much going on that it was a job to focus my eyes on anything for long enough to find out what it was. I was conscious of being hemmed in by the most gigantic buildings, so high that surely they must pierce the heavens. Of being jostled about by the never-ending crowd, of being hooted at by what seemed like 100 impatient drivers every time I thought about crossing the road. But somehow I felt neither lonely nor afraid, for there was an air of suspense, of excitement, and gaiety, and I felt rather as if I had wandered onto the stage during the performance of some revue. I knew nobody in New York, but had been corresponding with a Sierra Leonean who had graduated from Lincoln University. He was not expecting me, so I called a taxi and directed the driver to his address in Harlem that he had given me in his last letter. Luckily he was in, and he made me very welcome. I felt immediately at home in Harlem, and sometimes found it difficult to believe that this was not Accra. I would have been very happy to stay longer, but 2 days was all I could spare. I was already nearly 2 months behind schedule. The school year had begun, and I was in a hurry to get to Lincoln and begin my studies. I had written to the dean, both from the Gold Coast and again from Liverpool, explaining the delays, but I could not feel secure until I presented myself and was admitted. Lincoln University, founded in 1854, was the first institution in the United States to give higher education to Negroes, and to train these students for service and leadership within the Negro population of the United States. The idea and its achievement were the direct result of the inspired efforts of the Reverend John Miller Dickey, a Presbyterian minister, and his Quaker wife, Sarah Crescent Dickey. When I arrived at Lincoln, I had only the equivalent of £40 in my pocket, a second-class teacher certificate, and a letter of introduction from Mr. S. R. Wood. I went to the dean and explained my financial difficulties, that £40 was all the money I possessed, but that I was prepared to work my way through college. He did not take readily to this. No doubt he had heard the same tale too many times before, but as the only alternative was to ship me back to the Gold Coast, and as he was too kind-hearted to resort to such a measure, he accepted me. I was put on probation on the understanding that if I did well in the forthcoming examination, I would be allowed to enter the freshman class. It was a challenge because I was 2 months behind the rest of the students, but after much hard work, I sat the examination and was awarded a scholarship. Lincoln was small, competition for places was severe, and it was made very clear to all of us that there was no room for slackers. There was accommodation for only about 200 students or so. If anyone dropped consistently much below the second grade, he was asked to leave in order to make room for the next and possibly more conscientious applicant on the waiting list. When a student was classified as grade 1 or grade 2, he was awarded a scholarship, which meant that each semester a certain amount of money was allowed him by the university for his fees. Luckily, I always made the first or second grade, and so during the whole of my time at Lincoln, I was helped by scholarship money. Although this paid only a part of my expenses, it was of vital importance to me. There were 2 opportunities of earning money which were open to scholarship holders only. We could act as library assistants and also wait in the dining hall. As it happened, the work in the library was of a great pleasure to me, but in any case, there was no job, however distasteful, that I would not have attempted at that time. I found another profitable occupation later on when our sociology and economics lecturer gave us a lot of private reading to do, from which we had to make reports. Many of the students made very heavy weather of these reports, and grudged having to spend their spare time writing them up. So ever on the lookout for means to line my pockets, I undertook to write the report to them $1 at a time. In this way, I raised quite a few dollars towards my out-of-pocket expenses. I was still very interested in speech making, and during my first year took part in the freshman oratorical contest, where I gained second place and won a gold medal. Unfortunately, this medal was later taken from me as a souvenir by one of the many girls whom I knew, but with whom I could spend very little time. Another girl relieved me of my frat pin. This was a mark of membership of the Phi Beta Sigma fraternity of Lincoln, the motto of which is culture for service and service for humanity. It was a source of wonder to me that after the grueling initiation ceremony, members were not left with more permanent marks of membership. I remember it as one long period of torture and humiliation, the most memorable moments being when my trousers were ripped off in front of everyone, when I was chased like a fox by the hounds across fields, captured, beaten, then pushed blindfolded through a hedge. I must admit that the ordeal nearly got the better of me. I suppose there is nothing like suffering and hardship to bind people together, for once you had made the grade, it was a great fraternity to belong to. I also became a Freemason of the 32nd degree for as long as I was in the United States. I had never experienced any difficulty in getting along with my fellow students, but I was very touched and highly honored when they voted me as being the most interesting among them, recording this in the class yearbook of 1939. I graduated from Lincoln in 1939, a Bachelor of Arts, with a major in economics and sociology, but could not get my degree straight away as I still owed the university some money. My original intention on leaving Lincoln was to enter Columbia University School of Journalism, but I was so financially crippled that this was quite out of the question, for the time being at any rate. I was again very despondent, but just when my prospects seemed at their blackest, I received a letter from the professor of theology and philosophy at Lincoln, Dr. Johnson, inviting me to return there as an assistant lecturer in philosophy. This was quite an honor, but not what I had planned for myself. However, I really had little option, for the nature of my passport as a student was such that I was not allowed to stay out of school during the winter months. I sat and thought about it. The offer had certainly arrived at the most opportune moment. I was desperately broke. Maybe it was the hand of fate. In the end, I accepted, and so in the autumn of that year, returned to Lincoln as a philosophy assistant. I thoroughly enjoyed it as it turned out. but I was not fully occupied. To my way of thinking, unless I was busy pretty well the whole of the 24 hours of each day, I was wasting my time. I spent my spare moments reading every book of modern philosophy that I could lay my hands on. After acquainting myself with the works of Kant, Hegel, Descartes, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, Freud, and others, I appreciated the truth in the saying that law, medicine, and the arts are the arms and legs of learning, but philosophy is the brain. Later in the same year, I gained admission to the Lincoln Theological Seminary, and at the same time arranged to continue my studies in philosophy and education at the University of Pennsylvania in order to get my master's degree. The previous July, I learned that I had been awarded a scholarship of $100 by the Presbytery of Washington. This was really wonderful news, and it could not have come at a better time, for with this money I was able to pay for some of the courses at Pennsylvania. I graduated from the seminary at Lincoln with a Bachelor of Theology degree in 1942 at the head of my class. As was the custom, the duty fell to me to deliver my seminary graduation oration that year. The subject I chose was Ethiopia shall stretch forth her hands unto God. It was delivered extempore, and I was a little dubious as to its success. However, when professors and past students rushed forward at the end to shake my hand enthusiastically, I knew that they had appreciated it. In the same year, I received my Master of Science degree in Education from the University of Pennsylvania. By this time, I had also become a full instructor in philosophy, first year Greek, and Negro history. Negro history was a most popular subject, and the classroom was always packed to capacity. I think I enjoyed lecturing on this subject as much as my audience appeared to enjoy listening. Another course which I liked was social philosophy. This also attracted a lot of students to my class. However, I never considered myself to be anything more than a novice, and it was consequently a very pleasant surprise to me when, in 1945, the year I left America, I was honored by the Lincolnian, a magazine of the Lincoln University, which voted me the most outstanding professor of the year. In February 1943, I received a Master of Arts degree in philosophy from the University of Pennsylvania, where I had studied under Professor Edgar Singer Jr., and had begun to prepare myself for the Doctorate of Philosophy examinations. In spite of the fact, apart from teaching and studying, I was having to travel backwards and forwards 3 times a week, from Lincoln University to the University of Pennsylvania, a distance of well over 50 miles. I managed within 2 years to complete the course and the preliminary examinations for the doctorate. All that remained before the degree could be conferred on me was the writing of the thesis, but at the same time there were other demands on my energy. In order to keep body and soul together, I got a job as a counter in the Sun Shipbuilding Yard at Chester, where I worked in all weathers from 12 midnight until 8 the following morning. It froze so hard on several occasions that my hands almost stuck to the steel, and although I put on all the clothes that I possessed, I was chilled to the marrow. At 8 a.m. I used to return to my lodgings, have breakfast and sleep for a few hours, and then begin research for the writing of my thesis. One morning when I arrived home, I had my breakfast as usual, then went to sleep and did not wake up until 4 the following morning, a sleep of about 18 hours. When some of my friends called for me to go to work at the shipyard, my landlady, receiving no reply to her knocks on my door, assumed that I had already left. Without doubt, I was getting to the end of my tether, and it was soon after this that I caught pneumonia. It was a bitterly cold night, and I was shivering more violently than usual. At about 4 in the morning, I began to feel very ill and simply did not know how to carry on. I went to the company's doctor to ask if I could be excused further duty. I felt that if only I could get home to bed, all would be well. When he took my temperature, however, he immediately summoned the ambulance and rushed me off to Chester Hospital, where I was put into an oxygen tent in a supposedly critical condition. In spite of this, I was fully conscious and my mind was perfectly calm and clear. As I lay in bed, I had time, at last, to view my life in reasonable perspective. It seemed folly to struggle on as I had been doing, trying to use all the 24 hours of each day. Coupled with this, probably because I realized how close I had been to death, I longed to see my mother again, more than anything else in the world. By the time I was able to get out of bed, I had made up my mind that I would leave America and return home as soon as ever this could be arranged.